You have to trust your people to manage their time, to communicate effectively, and to get the job done. And that requires a real shift in mindset for a lot of leaders.
Today we're tackling something that I know is on everyone's mind these days, company culture, especially when your team isn't all in the same room or even the same time zone. We've got a great lineup of articles from Forbes and MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'm excited to really dig into the insights they offer. The goal here isn't just to survive in this new world of work, but to really thrive, to build a culture that's actually stronger and more adaptable than ever before.
I think you've hit on a really crucial point there. It's not about trying to recreate the old office dynamics in a virtual setting. It's about being intentional about what kind of culture we want to build in this new world. And one thing that really stood out to me in these articles is the emphasis on values. Not just having a set of values, but actually embedding them into every single aspect of the company.
Yeah, I think we've all seen those core values posters hanging in offices, but how do you actually make those values come alive, especially in a remote setting?
One article had a really interesting example. Actively calling out behaviors that exemplify those values, particularly in remote interactions. So let's say a team member goes above and beyond to help a colleague on a project. Don't just send a private thank you. Make sure that's recognized publicly in a team chat or a company-wide announcement. You're essentially reinforcing what truly matters in your culture.
I love that it's like making those values visible, even in a digital space.
Yeah.
And speaking of showing, not just telling, one thing that comes up a lot in these articles is trust, which feels even more crucial when you're not physically together.
Oh, absolutely. You can't micromanage a remote workforce. It just doesn't work. These articles are really clear on that.
It's like letting go of that need to constantly see what everyone's doing and instead focusing on creating the conditions where they can thrive independently.
Exactly. And that leads into another critical element that these articles highlight: communication. But it's not just about the tools, it's about establishing new rhythms and styles of communication that work for a distributed team. One article mentions something called semi-synchronous communication.
I've heard that term before, but honestly, I'm not entirely sure what it means in practice.
Yeah, it's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it? Think of it as a sweet spot between real-time meetings and asynchronous email. So tools like Slack or project management platforms allow for a more fluid, ongoing conversation. But without the pressure of everyone needing to respond immediately, it's about finding that balance between staying connected and respecting people's time and flow.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about creating a culture of responsiveness without that feeling of always being on.
Exactly. And it also goes back to that foundation of trust we were talking about earlier. Leaders have to trust their teams to use these communication tools effectively and responsibly.
So we've talked about these high-level principles of trust and communication. But are there some specific tactical things that companies can do to cultivate culture in a remote environment?
Oh, absolutely. The articles offer a whole toolkit of strategies, some of which might surprise you. Things like buddy systems, which I know can sound a bit elementary, but can actually be incredibly effective in fostering connection and collaboration among remote team members. Or virtual challenges and shared activities, which can inject a bit of fun and camaraderie into the workday. It's about finding creative ways to replicate those water cooler moments and casual interactions that happen organically in an office.
I love that it's about being intentional about creating those informal connections that can actually be so vital to team cohesion. But I'm also curious about how these ideas scale. What works for a small startup might not translate smoothly to a company with thousands of employees.
That's a great point, and the articles do acknowledge that one size doesn't fit all. What works for one organization might not work for another. It's about understanding the underlying principles and then adapting them to your specific size and structure.
So less about a one-size-fits-all approach and more about tailoring it to your unique context.
Exactly. Being adaptable, experimental, and always willing to learn and adjust.
And it seems like a big part of that learning comes from actively seeking feedback from your employees.
Absolutely. You can't lead effectively in a remote environment without having a finger on the pulse of your workforce. And one of the most effective ways to do that is through what the articles refer to as remote work surveys. But these aren't just about collecting data. They're about demonstrating that you value your employees' voices and are committed to creating a work environment where they feel heard and supported.
Okay, so let's dig into that a bit. What kind of questions should these surveys be asking? And how do you make sure they actually lead to meaningful change rather than just creating more noise?
That's where it gets really interesting. The article suggests going beyond just the typical satisfaction metrics. For example, one article suggested asking, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you feel your manager supports you in your remote work? It's a simple question, but it gets at the heart of something incredibly important, that sense of psychological safety and support, which can be so easily eroded in a remote environment.
That's such a good point. It's not just about having the right tools and processes in place. It's about ensuring people feel genuinely connected and supported, even from afar. And speaking of connection, here's where it gets really interesting.
Right, the MIT Sloan Management Review article takes a fascinating approach. They suggest viewing this whole shift to remote work not just as a challenge, but as a powerful opportunity for positive cultural change.
I love that, turning a disruption into a catalyst for evolution. But how do you actually do that? How do you move beyond just coping with remote work to actually leveraging it to build something better?
Well, that's where we'll pick things up in part two. We'll explore specific examples of companies that are using this moment to reevaluate their values, rethink their structures, and ultimately create a more adaptable, more human-centered way of working.
Sounds like a great place to leave it for now. We'll be back soon with part two of this deep dive into building a thriving remote work culture. Until then, keep those questions coming and keep experimenting.
Looking forward to it. It's almost like this whole shift to remote work has forced companies to hit a reset button,
Mhm.
shaking things up and giving them a chance to shed some of those outdated practices that weren't really serving them well anyway.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give me some concrete examples. What are companies doing that are really embracing this opportunity to create something better?
One of the most striking shifts is this move towards decentralized decision making. In the past, so many organizations were stuck in that top-down hierarchy. But remote work has kind of forced them to empower teams and individuals to make decisions closer to the point of action. And the results are fascinating. Companies are finding that this actually makes them faster, more agile, and more innovative.
So it's like cutting through the red tape, trusting your people on the front lines to make the right calls. I can see how that would lead to a more responsive, adaptable organization. But what about the potential downsides? Is there a risk of things getting too chaotic or losing that sense of strategic alignment?
That's a valid concern, and it's something these articles definitely address. They emphasize that decentralization doesn't mean abandoning structure altogether. It's about finding that sweet spot, empowering teams to act autonomously within clearly defined frameworks and guidelines.
So it's not about throwing out the rule book, but rewriting it for a more agile, networked world.
Exactly. And it requires a fundamental shift in mindset, both from leaders and individual contributors. Everyone needs to be comfortable with a certain level of ambiguity, to trust their colleagues, and to be proactive in seeking out information and resources.
It's a whole new way of working. And it sounds like it demands a different kind of leadership, too.
Absolutely. That command and control style of leadership just doesn't fly in a remote environment. Leaders need to evolve, become more like coaches and facilitators, setting the vision, empowering their teams, and providing support and guidance from afar.
Creating the conditions for success rather than dictating every step of the journey.
Precisely. And that brings us back to those remote work surveys we were talking about. They become even more crucial in this context. They provide that vital feedback loop, allowing leaders to understand how their teams are experiencing this new way of working and to identify any areas where they need to adjust their approach.
It's about being responsive, constantly learning, not just from these articles, but from our own people.
Exactly. And that's something that really comes through in these articles, the need for constant learning and adaptation. There's no single blueprint for building a thriving remote culture. It's an ongoing journey requiring experimentation, feedback, and a willingness to iterate and adjust along the way.
And that can feel daunting for leaders who are used to having all the answers.
It is a shift in mindset, but what's so exciting about this moment is that it's forcing us to rethink our assumptions about work, leadership, and even culture itself. It's a chance to build something truly new and transformative.
And it sounds like a lot of companies are still figuring this out as they go. It's not about having all the answers right now, but about having the right questions and being willing to experiment and learn along the way.
You're absolutely right. And that's where those remote work surveys can be so powerful. It's not just about collecting data. It's about showing your employees that you care about their experience and that you're committed to creating a work environment where they can thrive.
I'm really struck by this idea of using this disruption as a springboard for innovation. Instead of trying to recreate the past, it's about embracing the unique possibilities of remote work. and building something truly remarkable. It's a call to action for leaders to step up and be architects of a new, more human-centered way of working.
You've hit the nail on the head. It's time to move beyond simply managing remote work to truly leading in a remote-first world. And that requires a fundamental shift in mindset, a willingness to experiment, and a deep commitment to building a culture that empowers people to do their best work wherever they may be. This has me thinking, this raises a really important question for you, for anyone listening who's leading a team in this new world of work. How can you take everything we've talked about, these insights from the articles, and actually use them to cultivate a remote work culture that not only survives, but truly thrives?
It's a big question for sure. And it's one that I think a lot of leaders are grappling with right now, because it's not just about slapping together a few remote-friendly policies or buying the latest collaboration tools. It's so much deeper than that. Building a truly thriving remote culture, it requires a much more fundamental, more intentional approach.
And I think that's what these articles really drive home. It starts with a shift in mindset.
Yeah.
Letting go of those old ideas of control, of needing to see everyone physically present in the office, embracing a new model that's built on trust, empowerment, and flexibility.
I keep coming back to this idea that culture isn't so much about the where of work, but the how. It's
Right.
about those underlying values, the connections you build, the ways you support and inspire each other, all of that, regardless of location.
Exactly. And what's exciting is that we have this incredible opportunity right now to reimagine work entirely, to build organizations that are more human-centered, more adaptable, and ultimately more successful.
I feel like this deep dive has given me so much to think about. A renewed sense of optimism, and some concrete steps that I can start implementing right away. Hopefully our listener feels the same.
Definitely. And remember, it's a journey, not a destination. There will be bumps along the way. There always are. But with a clear vision, a commitment to learning, and that willingness to adapt, you can build a remote work culture that doesn't just meet the challenges of today, but actually thrives for years to come.
So to our listener, the leader navigating this new landscape, embrace the challenge, experiment fearlessly, and never stop listening to your people. The future of work is in your hands, and it's brimming with possibilities.